I started working, looking at timing and seasonal transitions at the continental scale, in some cases with the data that we were generating as part of the USA National Phenology Network, but also with a lot of climate data. And so what I want to do is just take kind of a bird's eye view of some of the things that we've been working on so that you can see what the pattern sources and the impacts of these timing variations and trends in seasonal transitions. So basically what's happening in the shoulder seasons, particularly in the spring, but also in the fall. But at the continental scale, at regional to continental scales. So So it's down, isn't it, Jonathan? Yeah. I have lots of people that have been working, collaborating with me on this that were on the previous slide. So this is kind of a community of practice that's developed around the National Phenology Network. So I want to give you some background. So I'll talk a little bit about the genesis of the network. You can log on to the network at usanpn.org. If you're interested in making observations as part of the Citizen Science Network, you just pick your state. The protocols for lots of different species are available to you. You can actually start making observations as soon as you're ready and be part of the network. So I encourage you to look at the web page. There are also lots of data products associated with this web page that you might find interesting. So I want to provide some background, particularly in terms of the need to better monitor and understand spatial temporal phenological variations at continental scales. I do want to make a criticism of ecologists, and that is that they do almost everything locally and hardly anything at the continental scale. So we don't have very many ecological networks that are making standardized routine measurements at lots and lots of sites at sufficient density at the continental scale. Ecologists like biocomplexity, so they like to measure the crap out of everything in one place. And they oftentimes are not interested in matching the spatial and temporal scales at which physical scientists work. And I'm kind of a half-breed. As Dan explained, I have a PhD in geosciences with a minor in ecology and evolutionary biology. But this is a huge gap that's in ecological science, and I think is going to become a problem as climatic predictability advances at hyperspeed. And the rest of us are asked to forecast the hydrologic consequences, the ecological consequences, the socioeconomic consequences, and we don't have data, theory, and models to do them with, and so it's going to be a huge challenge. So the third one, I want to talk about something called the National Climate Assessment that's part of the U.S. Global Change Research Program that has now adopted a whole series of seasonal timing and phenology indicators that is being used at the national scale and by lots of different stakeholders. And I'll concentrate on a couple of these. One is a set of spring indices that are actually constructed from daily Tmax and Tmin at any station that you can get it, or across any surface where you can estimate daily maximum and minimum temperatures. And so I'll mostly concentrate on first leaf and first bloom. So these are continental scale phenological models, products that can be used to explore spatial temporal variations in seasonal timing. Another one is the timing and duration of the frost-free season. In other words, from the last spring frost to the first fall frost. I do want to talk a little bit about this 1980s step change that I talked about in my earlier talk that is driving many of the things that all of us are talking about, whether it's in the West, the increase in the number of large fires, these big ecological droughts that we're seeing, the advance of spring snowmelt, of the advance of stream flow from spring snowmelt. A lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of climate change are due to the step change in springtime temperature. And it's not just something that happens in the US, but it's a big step change at the global scale. And then at the end of my talk, I want to talk a little bit about the promise of subseasonal to seasonal environmental forecasting that I think all of us are going to be asked to play in. We're going to see improved climatic predictability anywhere from a season to a decade in advance. And from now on, we're going to be asked to forecast the consequences. And again, I don't think that we're really ready for that. In most of the sciences, like ecological science, we didn't grow up for 40, 50, 60 years wondering if at some point we were going to ask to do seasonal forecasting of ecological processes. So the National Phenology Network is actually something that developed out of a grand challenge effort in summer of 2004, where ecologists identified 6 major grand challenges in the ecological sciences, and they revolved around biodiversity, biogeochemical cycling, ecological impacts of climate change, invasive species, infectious diseases, and the impacts of land use. And in summer of 2004, there were 6 workshops in different parts of the United States to address or to look at how something called the National Ecological Observatory Network, which now is a $500 million program funded by NSF, how the National Ecological Observatory Network would address these grand challenges. So I was asked to actually run the workshop on ecological impacts of climate change, which I did in Tucson, invited prominent scientists, including some National Academy members, and we spent 3 days trying to figure out how this new network, the National Ecological Observatory Network, would actually address some of these grand challenges. And there were 11 recommendations, but one of them was to create a national phenology network, which NEON at the time, this $500 million program, didn't want to do. So after the workshop, I actually approached a couple of people and NSF, and they funded an initial effort to start a national phenology network. And so by 2005, we'd run the first workshop, and by spring of 2006, I'd convinced USGS to actually provide the base stable funding for such a network. And you'll see what the network is about as we move into the talk. At the time, NOAA was modernizing its national co-op network for weather data, and they were automating it, so it was freeing up a lot of observer time, and we thought we could use the freed up manpower at these weather stations to actually make phenological observations. So there were a number of recommendations that came out of this that led to the establishment of the National Phenology Network, that followed in the footsteps of a friend of mine who's now dead. His name is Joe Caprio. And Joe was actually hired in 1956 at Montana State University in Bozeman to be the state climatologist. And he wanted to help farmers out. So one of the things that he decided to do was to start a Western states phenological network. And at the time, we're not talking about everybody having a desktop computer. So literally what he would do is send out these postcards to people with a phenophase, with whether it was bud burst, leaf out, first bloom, or whatever it was, and he'd have the protocols all written out. And so people would actually make the observations, but the observations were based on lilacs and honeysuckles that were planted by pioneers all over the western United States. So he grew this network from a few hundred stations to about 2,500 stations. And then in 1994, by 1994, he had this beautiful network that was operating like clockwork. And but he decided to retire. And usually these networks are heroic efforts, and the minute that the hero retires or dies, they're over with, and there's never really a successional plan. And so when my colleague Mark Schwartz and Mark Schwartz is at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, who had worked on phenology for his dissertation and over the years, when Mark and I got together to start the National Phenological Network, we immediately realized that we had to have a federal agency behind it, which ended up being the USGS, to provide stable funding and actually to make sure that there was a successional plan with the leadership. This took a number of years, but by 2007, the germ of the idea was there in 2004, and by 2007, we had a network. I set up an office, a national coordinating office at the University of Arizona, and hired an executive director and a staff, and we were open for business and actually recruiting and instructing observers all over the country. It's now a fairly big network with high density of observers. We probably have now close to 10,000 observers all over the country. When you see a map of observations or observing points in the country, whether it's stream gauges or phenology or birds or whatever it is, it always looks like a human population map for obvious reasons. That's where the observers are. So Nevada, for example, is this black hole of observations. So we started this large-scale network of repeated and integrated plant and animal phenological observations and the tools to analyze them at local to national scales. There's a citizen science program within the National Phenology Network that's called Nature's Notebook, and anybody can participate. But again, lots of data products that if you're a student and you're looking for data to analyze, you can download the data and play with it. So lots of different plant and animal species for which we have protocols and people are making observations. And so it's really gratifying to see, basically millions of observations that have come in since 2007. So we care about phenology because it's so integral to surficial processes. So changes in seasonal timing affect a ton of things, from minutes to hours, days to weeks, year to centuries, all these things that we care about, whether it's climate itself or geochemical cycles, the water cycle, practically everything is affected by phenology in one way or another. So it really does matter. Phenology is really an integrative science where you have lots of disciplines coming together. I think most people think that because it's really the seasonal cycle that we know a ton about it, and the reality is we don't. In the climate system itself, we actually don't have indices of atmospheric circulation changes that result from going from winter to summer, for example. We don't have indices of spring in atmospheric circulation. we don't really understand the shoulder seasons, whether it's spring or fall, very well at all. Most of the modeling is actually done in the dead of winter and the dead of summer, where the climate system is a lot more normally behaved. Yet a lot of the variance is actually in the shoulder seasons, in spring and in fall. So there are all these studies that have been done recently that expose the fact that we don't know very much. I was part of a study that came out in Nature in 2012. That was actually a really clever study done by a postdoc that was part of a working group that I participated in, Lizzie Wolkovich. And what Lizzie and us and we did was we did meta-analysis of two sets of data. One were warming experiments all over the Northern Hemisphere that had been done for about 20 years, where people were actually measuring phenophase as a result of the warming experiment. So these are artificial experiments in natural settings, where people would do experimental warming, and then you would look at things like bud burst and leaf out and flowering, relative to the warming. And then we did a meta-analysis of observational data where people like the National Phenology Network, where there are a lot of places in both Europe and North America where people had been making observations of plant phenophases for decades, for a number of years, but usually just at particular stations. And so as part of the meta-analysis, when you do a meta-analysis, you want some sort of common metric to be able to do the comparative study. And for us, it was the sensitivity of the phenophase to the warming, to temperature. And so we had a metric to measure that temperature sensitivity, and then we compared it across the warming experiments and across the observational data. And it turned out the warming experiments underpredicted the historical observations by factors of 4 and 8 for leafing and flowering. I mean, that's 4 times and 8 times. So right off the bat, we knew we had a problem. Which numbers would you use if you were plugging into a land surface model? Which numbers would you plug in? Would you plug in the numbers from the warming experiments or from the observational data in terms of the temperature sensitivity of leafing and flowering? This is a huge problem because we spent so much money on these warming experiments and to a lesser degree on the observations. So it raised, it raised the question of whether or not the warming experiments were oftentimes plagued by artifacts in the experiments themselves. A similar study was an intercomparison of spring phenology estimated from remote sensing from Modus products between 1982 and 2006, looking at different algorithms and different satellite platforms. It turns out there was very little agreement between different algorithms and different satellite platforms. So the truth of the matter is we're spending a couple of $2 billion a year on these satellite platforms, in part to measure something like the green wave, across the world that happens seasonally. And yet, in these different products, there's very little agreement for the start of spring metric. Another study that came, that was led by Andrew Richardson at Harvard. Eric and I were just talking about Andrew a minute ago. So Andrew actually looked at all the different modules and submodules for estimating phenology and terrestrial biosphere models that are coupled with climate models to make predictions. And it turns out that there was very little agreement between the different biospheric models to estimate phenology. Not only that, none of them really were very good at predicting what was happening with phenology and fluxes in carbon and water at flux tower sites throughout the Northern Hemisphere. And so we're spending, again, lots of money doing this stuff, and there's very little agreement. So we know a lot less about seasonal timing and phenology at these scales than we think we do. And yet, it's pretty important. And one of the reasons that it's really important is because we're seeing, over the last 50 years or so, really incredible changes in the annual phasing of daily temperatures globally, but in the Northern Hemisphere. So this is a study that was done by Lex Stein and Peter Huybers. The first one was published in Nature. And so they took all of this daily temperature from both the ocean and land, and just focus on land now, which are the red dotted curves and the red solid lines. So you're looking at the dotted line is 1900 to 1953, and the solid lines are 1954 to 2007. And so you're looking at the annual phasing of temperature over the year. And instead of doing what you would expect from global warming, which is just getting hotter, and you're offsetting that daily march of temperatures upwards, instead what you're seeing is actually a shift earlier by an average of about 1.2 days. And we don't understand what that is. So the phasing of the seasonal cycle is really influenced by changes in atmospheric circulation during springtime. The amplitude, how high that curve is actually affected by winter temperatures. Most of the variability is related to two modes of atmospheric circulation. They're called the Northern Annular Mode and the PNA, or the Pacific North American Pattern. I won't go into too much detail except to say that the Northern Annular Mode is just a measure of how much air mass volume there is at mid-latitudes as opposed to high latitudes. And the PNA is actually a description through a very simple indexing of 500 millibard potential heights to describe the waviness and position of the jet stream in the Northern Hemisphere, which is responsible for either advecting cold air from the Arctic or advecting warm air from the tropics. And so the PNA basically describes the waviness of the jet stream. If you heard a lot of people talking about the polar vortex in the last couple of years when the winter got really cold in the east, it involved this big Rossby wave, this sinuosity and position of the jet stream. So it turns out that this big shift of about 1.2 days happened as a step change in the 1980s. The shift is actually not predicted by any of the general circulation models that are being forced with greenhouse gases. So it's such a big thing, and it's had such an impact globally, that not to understand it means that we potentially we'll have a problem making predictions if we don't understand what's caused this particular change. And anyways, this shift of the whole annual phasing of temperatures earlier is kind of a big mystery. So I talked a little bit about this. We don't really have a lot of indexing of the climate system that allows us to understand the shift in atmospheric circulation that's responsible for going from winter to summer. And in fact, what it entails is going from very strong, in the Northern Hemisphere, going from very strong westerlies in the wintertime to kind of weak polar easterlies in the summertime. And how that occurs is not very well known. In fact, probably the thing closest to us is something called sudden stratospheric warming that emanates out of the tropics, transfers through the stratosphere, and ends up causing these warmings into the troposphere right around springtime. And that's about the closest it is. So we really don't have an indexing of these seasonal transitions climatologically. It's all viewed from the ground up. It's all viewed from phenology, from leafing, flowering, migration, emergence, hibernation, and then we sort of try to scale it up, all the way to the upper level dynamics in the atmosphere. And I think one of the things that we need to do now is go the other direction, go from the climate system down to the ground. So the National Climate Assessment is this big thing that is mandated by Congress, and as part of it, a group of us developed a system of these indicators, social, ecological, and societal indicators that communicate key aspects of the physical climate impacts, vulnerability, and preparedness. And these are things for everybody to use. So it's kind of keeping track of things that people consider important over time and space. So some examples of these that came out of a team that I was part of was this indicator system on seasonal timing and phenology, and it included things like surface climate seasonality, things that I've already mentioned, like last spring frost, freeze, first fall frost and freeze, cumulative annual heating, heat stress, those type of things, and a whole series of them that have to do with the seasonality of snow and ice, things that can be measured from satellite platforms, land surface phenology, ecosystem disturbance, not necessarily the number or the size of the fires that occur in any given year or annual area burn, but actually the season of flammability, flammable season timing and duration, the conditions that if you had an ignition would lead to fire. Organismal phenology, things like bird migration. I'm just going to talk about 1 and 2 that have to do with the timing of the onset of spring through these algorithms that we've created, and then some of the climate indicators, just so you can see how things are varying and changing over time at the continental scale. So we've created these spring indices, which are weather-based algorithms of plant development that are calibrated and validated with lilac and honeysuckle observations. We're no longer encouraging people to make observations on honeysuckle since it's an invasive species, particularly troublesome in the east. So the core of this indicator network now is based on lilac observations and primarily on a clone lilac. So it's actually the same individual that we're sending out to people all over the country, and they plant it in their yards and then they make phenological observations. So we're using those records to actually continue to improve the model and validate it. So we use day length, synoptic warming events. So these are basically episodic events during the early spring when you're getting the advection of warm air from the tropics, but it's not sustained enough. But actually the plants are seeing these events. So we figure into the equation the number of times this happens, and then just the warmth accumulation, growing degree days, growing degree hours. And so we can calculate things like first leaf, first bloom. We have a damage index that is basically when it's the timing of the leaf out or the flowering relative to the timing of the last freeze. So a lot of the changes in climate, and particularly in springtime, climate and season creep are that if the spring starts too early, the plants are actually susceptible to a deep freeze. So we can calculate lots of different indices and map them out at the continental scale. Initially, just where we had daily Tmax and Tmin that were being observed, but now we use reanalysis products that interpolate between all these sites using a combination of statistical and physical models. So now you can actually map out the spring index at the continental scale in a continuous surface. So it doesn't look like there are that many sites in the Midwest. In the East, the Western Phenological Network has all of these sites for lilacs where these observations are being made that we use in informing and also in validating the model. This was a paper that used some of the raw data and some of the raw lilac and honeysuckle data back in 2001 that was really seminal because it showed that this phenological index was really closely tied to things like spring snowmelt and stream flow from snowmelt, really closely related, and it kind of pointed the way. It made us realize that we really needed to increase the amount of data that we had to create these sort of next generation continental scale phenological models that people could use for a variety of purposes. And so we needed more observations. This paper was written by a group of friends of mine that with USGS that collaborated with Joe Caprio, the guy that started the Western States Phenological Network. And by this time, Joe had retired. And so Dan Cahan and Mike Dettingers and others, they convinced a few of the remaining observers from the Western States Phenological Network to start making observations again. And so the paper in part was generated using this revival of a few dozen sites across the western US. So we started writing lots of different papers. My colleague Mark Schwartz wrote a seminal paper in 2000 where he was using the spring index to look at how spring was changing at the continental scale, and was kind of the first to really identify in the phenological data this step change right around 1984 that you see right down here. And you'll see that over and over and over again in these data. So the indices are basically based on these time series of 3-day growing degree hour accumulations. This is for a station in northern Arizona, and that's taken into account the accumulation of warmth, but also these episodic events of advection of warm air. So it keeps counting those synoptic events, and they're shown there with the arrows. Initially, the model took into account the fact that a lot of plants need chilling in order to start the leaf out or a flowering process. But unfortunately, if you need chilling hours, you can't really do the whole United States. So at one point we did a comparison with and without chilling hours and realized that the patterns in time and space at the continental scale were not affected at all by chilling hours. So we literally dropped it in the algorithms. So anyways, the model tallies up the chilling hours, which are hours spent below 2.2 degrees C until the requirements met. And then after the chilling is satisfied, it keeps checking the accumulation of recent growing hours, a number of these high energy synoptic events. And at some point, either first leaf or first bloom, depending on what you're looking at, is assumed to have occurred. So there's a whole suite of indices that you can calculate. One of the things I like about it is that it's not very biological, and so it sees only the atmosphere. And it can be generated for any location where you have Tmax, Tmin, or reanalysis data. The output is consistent everywhere, well validated, and then it sees only the atmosphere, so it's free of local biological effects, and even more so if you're using clone lilacs for observation. You're observing basically one individual across the country. So we've written a number of papers that look at the patterns at the continental scale and have learned quite a bit. For example, in the southeastern United States, there was a step change right around 1959 where instead of advancing, the spring actually delayed after 1959. And then later on, kind of got in line with the rest of the country. And the step change is actually linked to the Arctic oscillation and also to the tropical Pacific, decadal variability in the tropical Pacific that's actually internal to the system. So oftentimes when you look at maps, and I probably have a couple of figures that will show this, the southeastern United States is not keeping pace with the rest of the country. And people refer to this as a warming hole. And that is an area in the country or an area in the world that where it's not warming at the pace that it's warming everywhere else. And the reason is that it's responding to internal decadal variability, particularly in the Pacific. So the southeastern U.S. tends not necessarily to be in phase with the rest of the country, and in fact, oftentimes anti-phased with the Pacific Northwest. When it's an early spring in the Pacific Northwest, it's actually a late spring in the southeastern U.S. and vice versa. So that last paper that we published in International Journal of Climatology, a lot of some of the reviews that we got back kind of questioned how critical this spring index was for things that actually mattered. And so I called up a couple of friends of mine, one that had this long time series of Anjou pairs in southeastern Oregon, and then another group that had data from wheat nurseries at 6 different agricultural stations from North Dakota down to Texas. And so we took the spring index and averaged it over the same spatial domain for the state of Oregon, and then, you know, across the plains from north to south. And we plotted them against the blooming of Anjou pears, and then this phenophase for a Russian cultivar called Kharkov, where they actually measure, they make the same measurement of phenophase every year, which is when the flowering stalk emerges from the flag leaf. And on the left, you have the Anjou pear metric in the blue, and then the spring index in the red. And the most difficulty we had was actually in graphing it and trying to get the blue curve to separate from the red curve. So you can see how predictive the spring index is for Anjou pears. And the other one for wheat headings, it actually does pretty well. The times that it doesn't do very well are actually during the 1930s and the 1950s drought. And that's because wheat farming is mostly dry farming. And so it doesn't really matter what temperature is doing if there's not enough water. And so you can take this index, I'm not going to do this for this talk, but you can take this index and add something like vapor pressure deficit and probably capture most of the variance, explain most of the variance. So these things are really useful at the continental scale and at regional to continental scales. And the other thing is that there are subseasonal to seasonal forecasting, climate forecasting is starting to improve really fast. There's some real advances. So if you can actually predict forecast the spring index you can forecast all these things that matter to people. So the spring index, you can use it to evaluate all sorts of things, including the record spring that we had in March 2012, where over 70 records at the continental scale where temperature records were broken. Really unusual spring, so much so that in the 112 years of the spring index, average at the continental scale, 2012 is actually the earliest spring on record. And again, you know, you see that time series at the top here. Oops. You see that time series here at the top left, and you can see this step change here. So using these algorithms like the spring index and comparing them with land surface phenology metrics, you can sort of see the impact of these early, very early or very late springs. So it's a nice metric at the continental scale to track, you know, what's going on with the spring and a lot of the things that matter to us. So there is some predictability in ENSO and El Nino Southern Oscillation. And so we published this paper back in 2012 on the influences of El Nino, La Nina, and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation on the timing of the North American spring. And generally what happens is there's this dipole between the Pacific Northwest and the Southeast. And in some areas, it's actually fairly predictable. So we know that it's going to be an El Nino usually by late spring, early summer, that then is going to affect the following spring. The advances in climatology right now are fast and furious. So it used to be that people thought you couldn't go past the previous spring to predict anything in the current spring, and now people are writing papers with breaking the spring barrier in the title. So now there's this possibility of multi-year forecasts. And so it could end up being that we could actually, temperature is a lot more predictable than precipitation. So it could be that we have things like the spring index that we can actually predict far in advance, and whatever impacts or influences are associated with that spring index. You can look at anomalies like 2012 with this bullseye over the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes area. Or you could look at a year like 2015, where the spring was particularly early across the West, including the Pacific Northwest. So you can track anomalies over time. We've used the spring index to look at modes of variability and the timing of spring across the western U.S., basically doing principal component analysis of the spring onset data. In this particular case, the first principal component that explains most of the variance is very much what you get when you correlate the Pacific North American Index to the spring index. So temperature tends to be highly spatially autocorrelated, meaning synchronous over large areas, and particularly in the winter and the spring. So an early spring in the West is an early spring over most of the West. A late spring is a late spring over most of the West. So temperature is relatively well behaved in its variability over large areas. The second principal component is actually related to the Pacific, to the North American mode, and it's basically a dipole between the northern part of the West and the southern part of the West. And they have the maps are the loadings, and the time series are the scores. So we're very familiar with these time series. They look like things that we know in terms of shifts in atmospheric circulation. So we can also see how things that are related are correlated in space and time. For example, the variability in first leaf dates from the spring index, and then April 1st snow water equivalent, and the patterns are all consistent and very well related. If you can predict one, you can predict the other. We can do this at the continental scale now with these reanalysis products that are continuous surfaces across the continent and across the world. So we can now plot this stuff out. On the left is a contour of the leaf index, the first leaf index, which is the gridded product, and then the bottom is actually using the station data, and it's pretty much the same pattern. And the same thing goes for the bloom index. And you can start looking at parts of the country in time and space. So this is the leaf index from 1979 to 2013, looking at the relative trends, negative in the Pacific Northwest and really positive over the Great Lakes and upper Midwest area. So you start looking at these patterns and trying to interpret them in terms of what people think is going on with greenhouse warming. And it turns out, for example, that a lot of what you see in the Northwest Cascades with the leaf index is actually climate variability, decadal climate variability on a background of anthropogenic warming. And so you don't really see identifiable specific trends that you would associate with global warming. Whereas in the Great Lakes area, you're seeing these trends with the springs getting earlier and earlier and earlier through time. And this is very typical, no matter whether you're looking at springtime temperatures or precipitation, particularly growing season precipitation in this area of the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes. The temperature is actually going up, the spring is getting earlier, and there's more and more precipitation. And I think is associated with the global warming, the increasing ability of the atmosphere to hold humidity with the higher temperatures. You can correlate it with lots of the different geophysical indices that some of you might have heard at, whether it's ENSO or the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the PDO, trying to get a handle of what variability in spring index looks like at the continental scale. You can also you can plot this up through time, so you get an impression of how the onset of spring varies over the years, kind of year by year. I'm getting to the point where I'm kind of now a connoisseur of these individual years, almost like vintage years in wine. And I kind of, it's an atlas for me, and I can tie things that were happening in terms of, agricultural, horticultural, fruit crop damages, for example, that are very much linked to this. 2012, that record springtime cost about, I think it was about $20 million worth of damage in the fruit industry. There's so many things that are tied to these patterns at the regional to continental scale in springtime. These are not necessarily perspectives that we had before. We generally just kind of look at temperature patterns, rather than timing of transitions. So a lot of these perspectives are, generally relatively new. So with the National Phenology Network, we're now looking at using these indices and having operational forecast associated with these indices. So you can actually take these maps. I don't know if this one will do it. So you can actually go on our webpage and follow the progression of spring at the continental scale, kind of day by day, and figure out, exactly where you are on the map. And I've actually given talks at places like Amherst or the University of Chicago, where in 2 separate years, the timing was such that spring was actually springing at the time that I was there. And so I would basically just plot up the maps and show people, here's where we are. And in fact, on the campus itself, you could see bud burst happening. And I'd be there for 2 or 3 days, and it would just, things would start blooming right when I was there. So these are really useful products. You can look at anomaly maps. This was April 1st, 2017. So this is an anomaly map for that particular springtime, showing this kind of bullseye over the Ohio Valley and in the southeastern U.S., where spring was occurring much, much earlier than it normally does. We've now got products that people in the national park system are using. Sometimes people don't realize that national parks, for a large part, they're cleaning out toilets, they're building roads, they're clearing roads, they're dealing with a lot of infrastructure. And the northern parks have to deal with winter infrastructure. So they have to winterize roads. You've probably been to parks like Glacier National Park, where they're shutting it down when you're there in September and October, depending on what's happening with the weather. So having some predictability and understanding of the phenology of park maintenance and all the things that people have to do, and also in managing natural resources, is really critical. So we've done this analysis of what's happening with the spring over time, and of course it's advancing over 3/4 of most of the parks we examine, and half of the parks are experiencing really early springs. We've done, I don't want to go on too much because I think I'm already kind of running out of time, but I want to push and show you some of the trends in last spring frost and first fall frost that are just really interesting and kind of crystal clear. We see this in a lot of data. So on the top is the length of the frost-free season, and in the middle is the last spring frost, and this is averaged over the United States, and at the bottom is the first fall frost. And you see these step changes for the springtime right at 1984, and for the first fall you see right around 1993. And these show up in a lot of data, but they have to do with the behavior of the atmosphere during the shoulder seasons, that when last spring frost dates and first fall frost dates are highly correlated with geopotential heights at 500 millibars. So, what the atmosphere is actually doing, and the anomalies are really correlated to this sort of tripartite pattern where you get high pressure over the continent and then low pressure over the Northeast Pacific and just off the southeast coast and the Atlantic. And so these are really strong patterns. So it shouldn't be that hard to actually develop climatological indices of spring and fall. These are 5-year moving averages of last spring frost date and first fall frost dates. And you can see these step changes that correlate really well with April-May temperature and September-October temperature, but also something called the circumpolar vortex, which is related to the Northern Annular Mode, and that is the expansion and contraction of the circumpolar vortex. And you can see these same change points, inflections, in these time series. For example, in 1984, for all of these springtime indicators, with the circulation types. You can also do this in stacked time series. So the 300 millibar circumpolar vortex size, the snow-covered area in North America in March, the first leaf date, again, these are 5-year averages. Also the center of timing, which is the a measure of snow melt stream flow in the western U.S. And in the western U.S., most of the things, most of the changes that we've seen in the West that are transforming the West have to do with these changes in springtime temperatures and the lead up to much hotter droughts than we've experienced in the past. So all of these time series, the spring index, wheat heading date, center of timing, number of fires exceeding 1,000 acres, total area burned, April 1st snow water equivalent, butterfly phenology in the Central Valley of California, they're all changing very sharply right around 1984, and we see this in deep time. So these are tree ring reconstructions in the northern and southern Rockies of snow water equivalent of snowpack accumulation, that in general the north and the south constitute this dipole that's responding primarily this anti-phase pattern. So when one is up, when the north is up, the south is down. This happens also in the Sierras. When the north is wet, the south is dry, and vice versa. But when you get right around to 1984, what happens is they're both going down in the same direction. So basically the water resources for about 70 million people in the West comes primarily from snowpack, and yet you're seeing this reduction in snowpack right around 1984 in both areas that portends really serious impacts from whatever it is that is happening, whether it's climate change or climate variability. So this is a dipole, an anti-phase pattern that is fairly robust over time, and it's now breaking down. So this is what I generally refer to as the hockey stick of snowpack in the West. It's actually part of a global pattern that a paper came out in 2016 about this post mid-1980s impact, and it doesn't matter how you stack up time series from the Arctic to the Antarctic, you see this step change that is primarily linked to springtime temperatures. You can see it in cherry blossom dates, whether it's in Japan, Switzerland, or actually in Washington, D.C. So this is a fairly big thing that's happening at the global scale that we really don't understand all that terribly well. I didn't show that last one. I just was talking without realizing that I wasn't showing it, but you can see here the change in the 1980s. And you see this in a lot of time series, and since we've had such a strong hurricane season, I thought I would put these anomaly trends up here of Atlantic hurricanes, global growing season length, western U.S. snow water equivalent, and global temperature, and you can kind of see the step change more or less simultaneously across all these different time series. If you forecast into the future what's going to happen with the timing of springtime, this was done by the student of a former student of mine. It's a paper that just came out where he's basically projecting what's going to happen to timing of spring at the this one is for the Midwest Great Lakes area, and it's really problematic. I mean, many areas of the United States probably will quit having the growing season will be year-round. We'll quit having a winter time. So the forecasting now is improving radically. This is a paper that came out in National Academy of Sciences, where the statement was that subseasonal to seasonal forecasting will become as common as weather forecasts are today. And I think this is becoming more and more critical, because the entities that do the best job of linking these subseasonal to seasonal forecasts to things that are meaningful, whether they're hydrological, ecological, or socioeconomic processes and impacts, are going to become indispensable. So people who are providing operational subseasonal to seasonal forecast on lots of things are going to be critical in our society. Anyways, this is the information that people actually need. And unfortunately, we don't have a huge amount of phenological data other than what's being created now for the National Phenology Network and what we get out of land surface phenology remote sensing products. So this is a really critical thing. And ecologists, because of the fact that they have not generated a lot of spatial temporally dynamic data at the continental scale over a long period of time, are kind of behind. They're behind in the process. I think, and we don't have black boxes. We don't have models that can do this without data. And I think it's unfortunate, because we're going to be asked to do this in the very near future. In the next few years, the public is going to ask us to make ecological forecasts based on these advances in subseasonal to seasonal and even multi-year forecast. And I don't think we're ready for prime time. We don't have the data, we don't have the theory, and we don't have the models. It's not something that we've been gearing up for 20, 30, 40 years to do. And it's we basically thought that at those timescales that climate was unpredictable. And so we never geared up to do this, but it's here now. So anyways, I'll stop there. Thank you.